can mean to turn, to incline. And then in its causative form, it could mean to turn someone aside, to turn something aside. And as most Jewish translations will indicate, to this day, the understanding here is of these words in context here, Achrei Rabim Lahatot, after the many, or after the great, to turn aside justice. What happens is there's a major Talmudic discussion, a famous Talmudic section in Baba Metzia 59, extended discussion there, where one of the great sages of the day has made a ruling about a particular oven that's called the Achnai oven. It was in pieces. Was it clean? Was it unclean? Because of the way it was structured. Some said it was called Achnai being snake because they snaked arguments around the thing, or some said that was the name of the owner of the oven, whatever the case is. He comes up with one ruling, and the other rabbis differ with his ruling. So he brings all kinds of arguments and proofs, but they don't receive his arguments. So he then says there's a series of miraculous events. You know, if the halakha, if the ruling is according to me, then let the walls of this house of study cave in, and they start to cave in. And another rabbi says, this is a dispute between sages. What does this have to do with you? And then the walls just stop, kind of frozen halfway. You know, if the law is according to me, let this tree be uprooted. The tree's uprooted. He asks for several signs, and each time they say, we don't receive the confirmation of a sign. We don't listen to miraculous confirmation. So he gives all the arguments, they don't receive it. And according to the story, he gives all his miraculous proofs and they don't receive it. So finally he says, if the law is according to me, then let God himself confirm it from heaven. And then the heavenly voice, the Bat Kol, is heard. The echo of a voice. And it's God saying, the halakha, the law, is always in accordance with him. And then one of the sages jumps up and says, Lo b'shamayim hi. This is the explanation that's given. The Torah is not in heaven. In other words, we don't listen to a voice from heaven. Why? Because the scripture says, Achrei Rabim Lahatot, we should follow the majority. Oh, hang on. That's not what it says. That's the end of the verse. And the end of the verse is saying, do not go after the majority to pervert justice. To put it in English, although this is an oversimplification, read it as if the text said, do not follow the majority. And then it was being quoted by this rabbi. It says, follow the majority. When we were little, out of a summer vacation home we'd go to, my sister and I were taking a walk down the street. I had to be under 5. Maybe she was 8 or something, and the little girl wanted to walk with us. And my sister said, you have to ask your mommy if you can go. It's one of these memories that sticks with you. And the little girl said, Mom? And the mother said, yes. And she said yes. But this is a little bit worse because the text says no, and it's been interpreted to say yes. It's not what the verse means. It's not what the verse can mean. Grammatically, it can't mean it. It's not the meaning of lehatot, which is to turn someone or something aside. It's just used a few verses later in the exact same meaning. It's used elsewhere in parallel expressions. That's why almost all, even modern Jewish translations, translate it right. And yet, this is given as a major support that you follow the majority. You don't even listen to a voice from heaven because the Torah is no longer in heaven. One of the great rabbis, German Orthodox rabbis of the 1800s, said that by teaching this, it saved the Torah. Because now it would be in the hands of men to interpret and work out, and anything else is impossible. Wow. A major text in a major discussion, interpreted in an impossible way. Follow the majority, whereas the text says don't follow the majority. And other examples such as that could be given. Number 6, the oral law has large critical gaps in its understanding of the written word due to the fact that most of its traditions came into existence centuries after those scriptures were written. It's an amazing thing. There'll be harmony on minute little issues about the Sabbath, and yet you read the rabbinic interpretations of Scripture, and they differ on so many verses. Why? Because they didn't have a tradition going back that far. Where their traditions develop, they have more harmony. The further back you go, the more questions. I mean, according to the rabbis, we don't know exactly all the animals listed in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 for, clean and unclean. We don't know all of the list exactly. That'd be pretty major. You think the tradition would preserve that? Certain sins, the person will be karet, cut off. Within rabbinic Judaism, there's a debate as to exactly what that means. That's pretty major. You'd think it would have that. Large, critical gaps are there. Why? Because there was not an unbroken chain of tradition going back. From when the traditions begin to develop, you have larger harmony. The further back, the more you look at biblical interpretation and key things, the more disparity you have, the more gaps you have. And then 7, the fact that the rabbinic traditions had to be put in writing, beginning as early as 200 CE, proves that there could not have been a previous oral tradition passed down from Moses to the rabbis, meaning a period of roughly 1,500 years without being written down. I asked a rabbi friend about that, and he explained to me that the people in biblical times, this was their lifestyle and culture, and they were on such a higher plane spiritually that they were able to maintain more of this. But then as time went on, we were not intellectually and spiritually as acute, then things had to be written down. Somehow that's not the picture you get reading the scriptures. You get the picture of a lot of dull, dark days. The idea that in the days of the judges, when everyone's doing what's right in his own sight, and there's massive Torah ignorance, that they were passing on these detailed oral traditions. It's almost like you didn't know the difference between a car, a motorcycle, and an airplane, and yet allegedly you could tell me in exact, minute detail how to build a car. Why is it that as time went on, the traditions had to be written down? According to the Talmud, it was forbidden. Forbidden to just pass on the written word orally, forbidden to pass on the oral word in writing. Well, the scattering of the people and the material kept growing and growing and growing. Why? Because more questions would come up, and more issues would come up, and more, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. To this day, ongoing, endlessly. As we quoted some of the great rabbinic sages, one in particular from the last century, saying that it's impossible to observe the Sabbath without massive study of Sabbath laws, and most people in his day and age just didn't have the time to do it. Of course, it goes on and on and on and on, and is rigorous and difficult. The idea that it was somehow passed on orally until a certain point in time, then it was put in writing, is not only illogical, it gives us an interesting insight. The only time we ever have it mentioned is once they started writing it down. Within a century or two of when they started talking about the oral law, that's when they started writing it down. When it's never written, they never talked about it. There's not an ancient Jewish document talking about it. There's not a biblical text talking about it within a couple of centuries of when they started writing it down. Because once the tradition started to develop, they had to write it down. You say, but how then do you live without the oral traditions, without the oral Torah? One thing is you can have a relationship with God that is close enough and intimate enough where you don't need the scaffolding. You don't need someone telling you exactly how to pray and what words to use and exactly what time of the day it has to be done, down to the smallest detail.